She ripped out my son's medical fridge and dumped his insulin down the storm drain. And yes, you heard that right. His insulin. I know it sounds insane, but that's exactly what happened. And the worst part? She didn't even ask. No warning, no knock on the door. Just decided on her own that our life-saving equipment was clutter. But let me back up for a second. My son Miles is 8 years old. He's smart, sweet, a little shy, and he has type 1 diabetes. Every moment of every day we live with the knowledge that his blood sugar could crash without notice. It's not a maybe, it's when. And if it does, we have minutes to react. Sometimes seconds. That's why I installed a compact medical fridge under the shaded side of our front porch. Easy access, always cold, always stocked. I'm a trauma care nurse, so I know how fast things can spiral. When I'm not home, his older cousin watches him. And that fridge? That little box is the reason I can breathe during my shifts. It's our emergency plan, our safety net. But apparently, it wasn't aesthetic enough for Judith Crowley. Judith is the HOA chair for our neighborhood, and I use that term very loosely because no one ever voted for her. She just kind of crowned herself queen of symmetry and clean gutters. You know the type: white visor, clipboard, and the power trip of a minor dictator. She saw the fridge one day while doing one of her patrols, and I swear to God you'd think I had spray-painted curse words across the lawn with how offended she looked. I'd already filed a medical exemption with the HOA board, weeks before, in fact. But Judith didn't care. She never reached out, never followed up. She just decided to take care of it. So while I was working a double shift at the hospital, helping actual people survive, she was behind my house with gloves on, yanking the fridge out of the wall and tossing the contents like it was expired yogurt. When I got home, I knew something was off the second I pulled into the driveway. The porch looked wrong, too empty. I ran to the side of the house and saw it. Fridge door hanging open, nothing inside. Just a smear of condensation where vials of insulin had been sitting just hours before. And then I found Miles. He was lying on the couch, pale and shivering, eyes half closed. His cousin was freaking out, telling me he'd started acting confused and then just faded. No insulin, no fridge, no backup. I didn't even have time to panic. I called 911, checked his pulse, started running through every worst-case scenario in my head. That moment, that exact moment, was when Judith walked up to my porch, clipboard in hand, and smiled like she'd just tidied my garden. "I went ahead and removed that thing," she said. "It didn't fit the HOA guidelines." I swear, for a second, I couldn't even speak. She looked at me, while my son was slipping into diabetic shock in my arms, and quoted policy. So yeah, this story, it's not about a fridge. It's about what happens when someone thinks rules matter more than a child's life. Stick around, because what happened next shook this neighborhood to its core. I don't even remember hanging up the phone. All I know is, one second I was dialing 911 with shaking hands, and the next, I was on the floor of my living room with Miles cradled against me. Sweaty, limp, not fully conscious. His skin felt clammy, like he was being drained from the inside out. I grabbed the glucometer I keep in my purse and checked his sugar. 421. If you know anything about diabetes, you know that number is terrifying, dangerous. It meant his body was trying to burn itself alive from the inside. I could hear the paramedics' sirens in the distance, getting closer. But every second felt like a lifetime. Miles's breathing was shallow. His lips were cracked. His eyes fluttered but didn't open. And Judith? She just stood there, clipboard in hand, still talking. "You should really review section 3.4 in the handbook," she said, like we were chatting about recycling bins. "No unauthorized exterior units visible from the street. It's all clearly written." I turned and looked at her. Really looked. And it was like something inside me just snapped. Not in a screaming, throwing things kind of way. No, this was colder. Quieter. Like a string had pulled taut and wasn't letting go. Judith didn't flinch. She just smiled politely and turned to walk away. The ambulance pulled up 9 minutes after I made the call. 9 minutes that I would relive over and over for weeks. The static on the line, the screech of tires, the the blur of flashing lights against my window. I climbed into the back of the ambulance without thinking. My hands were still covered in sweat, my heart in my throat. I tried to explain what happened to the EMTs, something about insulin, a fridge, HOA guidelines, but my words came out choked, messy, incomplete. Miles didn't stir. In the ER, I watched as nurses and doctors swarmed around him. Someone shouted, "Severe hyperglycemia." Another voice said, "Get this under control, now." And me? I stood frozen in the corner. I'm a nurse, for God's sake. I've worked trauma floors. I've seen the worst of it. But nothing. Nothing prepared me for watching my child become just another emergency. When the doctor finally pulled me aside and said we were lucky, 5 minutes later and it might have been cardiac arrest, I nodded like I understood. But I didn't. Not really. All I could think about was why. Why did this happen? How did someone I barely knew, someone who'd never even spoken to me like a human being, get to make a decision that nearly killed my son? And why did no one stop her? It wasn't until the next morning that I got an answer. There was a quiet knock on the hospital room door. I opened it to see Tom, our neighbor across the street. Vietnam vet. Retired plumber. The kind of guy who waves when you drive by but never says much. He stepped inside, holding his baseball cap in both hands like it weighed 100 pounds. "Annie, I saw something yesterday," he said quietly. "Around 2 p.m., I saw Judith out by your house. She had gloves on. She poured something into the storm drain, and then she pushed that little fridge into the HOA truck when it pulled up." I stared at him. "You saw her?" He nodded. "I figured you told her to take it. I didn't know what was in there. I didn't think it mattered." Didn't think it mattered. Those words hit me harder than anything Judith had said. Because here was a man who saw someone trespass on my property, destroy something attached to my house, and he just watched. No call, no text, not even a knock on my door. And he wasn't the only one. The whole street must have seen it. Her dragging the fridge, throwing it out like junk. But nobody stepped in. I felt something deep inside me crack, like a floor giving out under your feet. My neighbors had smiled at me for years, waved at my son, even handed out candy on Halloween. But when it really mattered, when his life was literally on the line, they chose silence. I didn't cry. Not right then. There was no room for tears. What I felt was rage. Not the hot, messy kind. No, this was cold. Focused. A sharp edge that settled in my chest and stayed there. Because if no one else was going to stand up for my son, I would. I left the hospital that afternoon, exhausted, unshowered, still wearing the same scrubs from the day before. And I drove straight to the police station. I walked in, looked the officer behind the desk dead in the eye and said, "I want to file a report. Attempted murder." He blinked like he didn't hear me right. "Excuse me?" I leaned in, voice steady. "Judith Crowley destroyed my son's insulin. She dumped it down a drain. He almost died. That wasn't vandalism. That was a choice. A reckless, deliberate choice. And I want it on the record." He hesitated, pen in hand. "Are you sure this isn't just a neighbor dispute? An HOA misunderstanding?" I didn't even blink. Does a misunderstanding put an 8-year-old in the ICU? That was the moment things started to change. When they stopped brushing it off. When someone finally took me seriously. And by sunset, Judith had been served. But that was just the beginning. The summons hit Judith's front door like a thunderclap. Official, unavoidable. By the time I got back from the hospital that evening, someone had already posted a photo of it on the neighborhood Facebook group. The HOA page lit up, then went silent. Posts started disappearing. Comments mocking my ugly little fridge vanished. Threads where people had joked about lazy parenting and overreacting moms were scrubbed like they never existed. And still, no one knocked on my door. No casseroles, no, "We're so sorry." Just quiet. The same people who used to wave at us now looked the other way when they passed. Some crossed the street entirely. Like my grief, my son's near-death experience was contagious, But I didn't care anymore, not really. Because the second that paper touched Judith's door, the game changed. She wasn't just a nosy neighbor with a clipboard anymore. She was a defendant, a woman facing criminal charges for destroying life-saving medical equipment. And I, tired, heartbroken, and furious, wasn't just some frustrated mom. I was a witness, a plaintiff, a mother who wasn't backing down. At the next emergency HOA meeting, held in the stuffy clubhouse down the street, I didn't sit with the rest of them. I stood near the back wall, arms folded, just watching. Judith walked in like she hadn't just turned a family's life upside down. She wore pearls and her usual smug smile, and stood at the podium like she was delivering a State of the Union. "I think we need to remember," she said, voice smooth like bad frosting, "why we created this HOA in the first place. For order, for consistency, not to be overrun by emotional exceptions." She never said my name, never said Miles. She said unsightly appliances. She said community integrity. She said, "What's next? Porta potties on front lawns?" A few people nodded. A few shifted uncomfortably. Most stared at their shoes. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. Because the silence spoke louder than anything I could have shouted. What she didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that this wasn't just going to stay inside our little neighborhood. A local news station picked up the story first. Some intern scrolling Facebook, looking for a filler story. But then it snowballed. HOA chairwoman under investigation for destroying child's medical supply. Insulin dumped over neighborhood aesthetic rules. Mother files attempted murder charge after HOA interference. The headlines got harsher by the day. I started getting calls from journalists, emails from strangers. Parents of diabetic kids from other states reached out just to say, "We're with you." Nurses messaged me to say, "I wish more families fought back like this." Then one morning, I stepped out of the courthouse for the first hearing. And there was a crowd. Not just reporters, not just curious onlookers, parents, nurses in scrubs, kids with insulin pumps clipped to their hips, holding cardboard signs that read, "Could have been me." They chanted. They held up photos. Some cried. I don't think I've ever felt so seen in my life. Judith arrived 10 minutes later, stepping out of a black sedan like she was still running a bake sale instead of facing a criminal hearing. Her lawyer trailed behind her, stone-faced. Her jaw was tight, her hair perfect. But her eyes, they darted. She was nervous. She walked through that crowd with her chin up, but her steps faltered when she saw the signs. When she realized people weren't whispering, they were watching, filming, judging. One woman held up a glucose monitor and shouted, "This is what you destroyed." Judith didn't respond. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with quiet tension. A dozen reporters sat in the gallery. Parents clutched purses like armor. When the prosecutor stood to speak, the room hushed. "We now have new evidence," he said, and clicked a remote. A screen lit up at the front of the courtroom. Grainy security footage appeared. And there she was. Judith Crowley, in gardening gloves, walking up to the side of my house like she owned it. She used bolt cutters to snip the lock, opened the fridge, pulled out the clearly labeled insulin boxes, Red Cross symbols, prescription stickers, orange warning tape. She tossed them into a trash bag. Then she grabbed a hose. And with cold, robotic calm, she sprayed the inside of the fridge clean, like it was dirt. The video paused on her walking away, wiping her hands on her shorts. The room stayed silent for a long time. Then Judith stood up, suddenly panicked. I didn't know. I thought it was junk. Just some old cooler or something." The prosecutor turned, voice like steel. "Did the word medical not register? The prescription labels? The thermal casing? What part of that said junk to you, Miss Crowley?" Judith's mouth opened. Nothing came out. He stepped forward, gaze sharp. "You didn't remove clutter. You destroyed a child's medication, without permission, without care. And that child nearly died." That was the moment. The moment the whole courtroom turned. The moment Judith stopped being strict or particular or just doing her job, she became what she truly was: reckless, entitled, and dangerous. And me? I wasn't just a grieving mom anymore. I had truth. I had witnesses. I had proof. For the first time in weeks, the power wasn't in Judith's hands anymore. It was in mine. The next morning, Judith's legal team made their move. A quiet request. No cameras, no statements, just a private meeting with the prosecution. I was called into a consultation room just outside the courtroom. Beige walls, cheap chairs, a clock ticking too loud in the corner like it was trying to remind me I hadn't slept in 2 days. Miles was curled up next to me, wrapped in his fleece blanket, still pale but stable. His little hand rested in mine, dotted with bruises from IVs and finger pricks. I couldn't stop staring at it. My lawyer sat across from me, flipping through his notepad. Then he looked up and said, gently, "They want a deal." I didn't say anything. "She'll plead guilty to reckless endangerment and property destruction," he continued. "No jail time, maybe probation, community service. She wants you to drop the attempted murder charge." I looked down at Miles again. His fingers twitched in his sleep. "She wants mercy," I said quietly. He nodded. "It's your call." I took a deep breath, trying to steady the storm brewing in my chest. Not just anger anymore. This was deeper. Something rooted in every sleepless night, every emergency glucose dose, every insurance fight, every time I'd had to explain to someone why my son needed that fridge. "She doesn't get to walk away from this," I said finally. "Not just for me, not just for Miles, but for every parent who's ever had to beg to be taken seriously. For every kid who's been treated like an inconvenience. She wanted this quiet. She wanted to erase what she did." I looked him in the eye. "Tell them no." Word got out within the hour. By the time Judith stepped outside to face the press, she looked like a woman unraveling. Her pearl necklace was crooked. Her mascara smudged just enough to betray how rattled she really was. Her attorney whispered something in her ear, probably trying to pull her back behind the courthouse doors, but she stepped forward, and she snapped. "I was just trying to keep our neighborhood clean," she shouted, her voice cracking. "I was doing what none of you had the guts to do. And now I'm the villain?" Reporters swarmed. "I didn't kill anyone," she screamed. "I didn't know it was medicine. That fridge was an eyesore. Don't pretend like you all wanted it there." The crowd turned on her instantly. Someone yelled, "Your job isn't to play God with someone's kid." A mom shoved forward, holding up her child's insulin pen like a battle flag. "You think this is decorative," she shouted. Judith's face twisted, half fury, half panic. And me? I stood just inside the glass doors of the courthouse, watching the whole thing unfold. I didn't move. Didn't smile. Just stood there. That wasn't justice yet. But it was truth. And the truth was loud. By the third hearing, the courtroom was packed. Every seat filled. Neighbors, reporters, parents, strangers. The air felt different. Not tense. Charged. Judith sat at the defense table, smaller somehow. Her eyes were red. Her shoulders hunched. When the judge read the charges again, attempted murder through willful destruction of life-saving medical equipment, you could hear the shift. That phrase landed heavy, sharp, real. She didn't interrupt this time, didn't protest, just sat there like a woman finally realizing the weight of what she'd done. My lawyer presented our case methodically, calmly, the footage, the neighbor testimony, the medical records, everything lined up. And then I took the stand. I don't remember everything I said, just the parts that burned. I told them about Miles's diagnosis, about the late nights, the seizures, the counting carbs, the panic attacks when his sugar dropped and I wasn't home yet. I told them about the fridge, how I researched it for weeks, saved up, filed the exemption, labeled it carefully, followed every rule. I told them I did everything right, and still, it almost wasn't enough. I looked right at Judith when I said that. "She saw it," I said. "She saw something keeping my son alive, and decided it didn't matter. She decided her preference was more important than his life." No one said a word. The jury didn't deliberate long. When the verdict came back, guilty on all counts, Judith didn't even cry. She just stared straight ahead, like her body was still trying to catch up with what her life had become. The judge sentenced her to 3 years in state prison, permanent removal from all HOA roles, mandatory counseling, and full restitution, financial and public. She didn't protest. She just stood there in her bright orange jumpsuit, silent. The room didn't cheer. This wasn't a celebration. It was a release. Like someone had finally taken their foot off my chest. When she was escorted out, she turned her head for a moment, just a flicker, and her eyes landed on me. But there was no smugness anymore, no authority, only fear. And maybe, just maybe, regret. I didn't look away. I needed her to see what it cost, because I hadn't just fought for my son. I fought for every parent who's ever been forced to defend their child's right to exist safely. And now, I had finally won. The week after the sentencing, her name vanished from every HOA file like it had never been there. No press conference, no apology, just silence, and a note in the HOA meeting minutes. New board elected. Zero tolerance for medical discrimination. People in the neighborhood changed too. Some packed up and moved, maybe out of guilt, maybe out of shame. Others stayed, but softened. They started waving again. Some even came over with muffins or coffee, awkward apologies half mumbled. A few couldn't bring themselves to say anything at all, but they left little signs in their yards. Literally. One said, "We support families, not rules." Another read, "A fridge saved a life." Judith didn't speak for us. And soon there were dozens, up and down the street like quiet rebellion. No speeches, no drama, just neighbors with paint and nails and a newfound backbone. I didn't ask for any of it. I wasn't trying to start a movement. I was just trying to keep my son alive. But something bigger happened. Something good. A few weeks later, I launched a nonprofit called Miles of Hope, named after the little boy who survived because we refused to be silent. We help families with diabetic kids get the supplies insurance doesn't always cover: medical fridges, emergency insulin kits, CGMs, education, advocacy. We connect parents. We fight for better HOA policies. In the first 6 months, we helped over 400 families. By the end of the year, we doubled that. We had volunteers from all walks of life: teachers, nurses, retired folks, even neighbors who once looked the other way. I still work late nights, answering emails with Miles asleep next to me on the couch, blanket pulled up to his chin, insulin pump blinking gently at his side. He's 9 now, stronger, louder, more confident. He wears a silver medical alert necklace and knows how to speak up when something feels wrong. He plays soccer again, right in the same front yard where it all happened. And on the wall, under the front window where the fridge used to be, there's a wooden sign, hand-carved, sealed against the rain. It says, "Here lives a mother who refused to let her child be sacrificed for silence." No one has ever tried to take it down. Across the country, other HOAs started rewriting their rulebooks. Some added clauses for medical necessity. Others quietly adjusted enforcement guidelines. I didn't pass a law. I didn't run for office. But people remembered what happened here. They remembered Miles, and that was enough. So if you're watching this, maybe you're a parent, or a neighbor, or just someone who's tired of watching people in power get away with treating human lives like inconveniences. Please, don't stay quiet. Don't look away when something feels wrong, because you never know what kind of difference one voice can make, until it refuses to be ignored. If this story hit home for you, do me a favor, like subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss what comes next. And if you want to help us continue the work, check the description below for how to support Miles of Hope. Thanks for listening. Thanks for caring. And above all, speak up.